I have the honor of introducing someone who is a distinguished veteran, someone who served in the United States Army as a strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst, accepted an appointment to be the military assistant to the director of the National Security Agency, who at the time was General William Odom. He's an adjunct professor of history, American history at James Madison University. And he's someone who has made a consequential decision in his life after redefining certain areas of our interests through the publication of a series of books, beginning in 1991 with the publication of JFK in Vietnam, which was updated for a second edition in 2017 and is one of the essential things that I would really want everyone to study. He followed JFK in Vietnam back in 1995 with the publication of a book called Oswald and the CIA, which was updated and revised, 2008 edition. Then he got out of the business. He'd done quite a lot, which included an extraordinary presentation at the Lancer Conference in 1999 called Mexico City, A New Interpretation. Dr. Newman, getting out of one area of deep immersion, enormous complexity, he required a break. It's understandable. Anybody would. So the difference is not anybody would think of taking a break and then write a book called Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism, but that's what he did during his break. The good news for us is that around 2012 or so, he got back into this study, this field, and he made a consequential decision, the result of which is, with the assistance of over a period of 25 years of our friend Jay Harvey, whose contribution should be noted and acknowledged. Because for 25 years, Jay Harvey has been significant in terms of Dr. Newman's progress. And so I think really it is a case of an ultimate scholar deciding that there is a subject that is sufficiently significant that he is dedicating the rest of his life to helping us come to a deeper and a better understanding. He began in 2014 with the publication of Volume 1 of what now seems to be almost certainly at least a 5 or perhaps 6-volume set on the assassination of President Kennedy. It's my honor to introduce Dr. John Newman.
Thank you, Alan. Alan is actually also a research associate of considerable talents and has been working assiduously with me on Volume 2 and 3. But I want to just recognize Jay Harvey. He called me up after he read JFK in Vietnam back in around 1992. He was in Greenbelt, Maryland at the time. I wasn't very far away, and he just called me on the phone. And we talked for a while, and then we met, and we started working together. We went to the Nara when it was a horrible place, a little room in a building where the windowsills came up to about here, and there was barely any lighting, and one Xerox machine that didn't work very well, and about 3 or 4 desks with horrible lights on them, and the first release of the JFK material were 5 brown boxes full of documents. And there were reporters out in the hallway with microphones asking what you found in the 5 brown boxes. But Jay was with me from that day forward, and we have spent countless dollars and countless years copying documents and working and reading and so on. And Jay, would you please stand up? Without this man, I would not be standing here talking to you today. Thank you. Thank you. I do want to reiterate something that was that Alan did say. I have 2 whole chapters on Bagley's work in Volume 3, which is coming out. I did brief Lancer last year on part of this, and also at Dr. Aguilar's gathering in San Francisco, but not the whole story. And Pete Bagley left us just before he died with not a book length, but a journal length, something called Ghosts of the Spy Wars. And it was addressed not just to specialists, but basically he was asking anybody out there who's interested to pick up where he left off. He didn't finish the story. He never found the mole. We think maybe the Kondrashov knew who it was, maybe he even told Bagley, but Bagley never said if he did. And I've made it a promise to myself and to Malcolm that until I die, I'm going to look for that mole. I'm hunting for that mole, spending a lot of time on it. Joe Bacchus is working with me on some projects, and haven't been able to identify that person yet. But we're hot on the trail. There's a lot of leads that Bagley left us. And the way to answer your question, ma'am, that you asked earlier, the way that some of this folds into the assassination actually is through the Nosenko angle of the story. When he defects in toto, right after the assassination, he is sent with poison, again, to mislead us about Lee Harvey Oswald. So there's the Nosenko story that took down Bagley and ruined his life and a lot of other people's lives is tied into that moment after Kennedy was assassinated and Nosenko was sent to the United States for good to mislead us. So, but my mission tonight is something else. It's I'm addressing in Volume 3, I'm finally in the strike zone for the Kennedy administration. And every time I turn around and look at what's in my strike zone, I'm finding things that I didn't know anything about and that are quite extraordinary. I dealt with Vesiana last year. That's in Volume 3. I did that here and in San Francisco. There's more material on that. And I dealt with the Nosenko issue as well. And the last almost half a year, I dealt with Sam Halpern, which I briefed you on yesterday, his defamation of Robert Kennedy. One of the other issues I picked up on is the race issue, which was not insignificant, of course. In the early 60 years, the civil rights movement was really moving at a fast clip, and there was a big problem for President Kennedy because at that time, the Democratic votes were from the South. And it was the election was quite extraordinary, the election of 1960. I deal with the race issue on more than that. I have a chapter on the freedom rides, which were just about the most awful story you could ever imagine in your life when you read the details of it, and that is chapter 6 in the book. But I had heard things about the 1960 election. For example, the Ward 1 in south side of Chicago being thrown into Kennedy's column gratis of the mafia there, stealing the ballot boxes. I knew about that. And the debates where Cuba and the missile gap, which really wasn't true, but at the time, these are issues in the election that a lot of pundits later on attributed to Kennedy's victory in a very, very close election. So I wanted to take a look at the issue of race in the election, and by the time I finished that chapter, my original first chapter for Volume 3 was called The New Frontier, the entire story of how Kennedy put together his program and what they did in the first 6 months. But by the time I got done writing about the election of 1960, I realized when I looked at it that it had to be the first chapter in the book. So I'm going to share that with you tonight and tell you about the race issue. Let me start with this single sentence. Slavery was our original sin in the United States. For a long time, the race issue has been a dark shadow hanging over our republic like none other. and it still curses us today. Fewer issues in our history cut as deeply into the fabric of American identity and moral purpose. In the 20th century, civil rights for African Americans became inextricably intertwined with the Kennedy presidency, more so than any other president except for Lincoln himself. By 1960, 1 century after emancipation, Southern white bigotry had succeeded in clawing back almost every step towards racial justice, save for slavery itself. Enmeshed in American electoral politics, segregation had become an accepted part of the American landscape. Where African Americans were able to vote, their votes were firmly in the electoral lockbox of the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party. By an act of providence, a series of events occurred in late 1960 presidential campaign that changed the course of history. White Americans who lived through the 1960 election do not remember the role that race played in the outcome. In a very close election, such as it was in 1960, the margin of victory can be attributed to many circumstances. But the truth is that the crucial role of the 1960 African American vote has been overlooked, especially as the event recedes into the past. Historians of the civil rights movement know differently. Can we go to the next slide? So in my presentation today, I'm going to lay out for you what I believe was a causal chain of events of 6 race-related events that led to Kennedy's victory in 1960. These 6 events took place during a crucial 14-day period, just before the election, in the following order. First one, on 17 October, JFK scuttled the proposed meeting with King. The second in that event led to the next one. King is arrested. If they had gone to that meeting, King wouldn't have been arrested. Because he didn't go to the meeting, King was at the lunch counter with the rest of the students down there in Atlanta, Georgia, and he got arrested. The next event after that is the charges were thrown out for that arrest, but at the same time, before they let him out of jail, they picked up a new charge that he had been leveled with. It was his license was out of date. He was pulled over by a patrolman. It was a minor traffic violation. And that was the third event. The fourth event happened shortly thereafter. The judge would not parole him for that traffic violation, and instead they threw him onto a chain gang at Reedsville, a terrible prison. And that is where the point was reached that if they didn't get him out of there, he would have been dead. Most people like him, black Americans that were considered a problem, never survived the chain gangs in Reedsville. So the next event was a call by Robert Kennedy, who actually did something wrong. He interfered as the Attorney General. He actually called an attorney, the judge. He called the judge and asked him why he would not parole King. And the judge changed his mind. And then the last one I'm going to talk about more in length is something that the campaign staff did behind Robert Kennedy's back. He was very angry that they were trying to use the black issue openly and in public. They thought that it would wreck the chances of the election. And so they did something behind Robert Kennedy's back that turned things around. There's a call, by the way, what they were using was a call that John Kennedy had made to Coretta King while King was in jail. And that played probably the major role at the end of the day. But if Bob Kennedy doesn't make that call to the judge, there is no King. So actually, Bobby Kennedy saved his life. And the call to Coretta King was the crucial thing at the last moment that turned that election around. Anyway, that's my outline. I'll try and stick to it in the time allotted to me this evening. Now, in order to go into this material, we have to understand King's thinking in terms of defying racial injustice in America. If I were to ask you who you would think was King's hero and the person that he studied and tried to emulate, you would come up with one name. And what would that name be?
Gandhi.
Yeah, Mahatma Gandhi, right? Well, you would be wrong. It's this man, a white preacher, an American preacher by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. King had lots of books by Gandhi, and he was interested in Gandhi's nonviolence, but it was the work of this man, and in particular his work, Moral Man and Immoral Society, published in 1932, when King was just 3 years old. He brought an end, Niebuhr brought an end to the classical liberalism in American theology because he successfully attacked the social gospel's premise of the innate goodness of man and the modern advance of reason could eliminate social evils. Anyway, Niebuhr said there was no evidence of this and wrote about it extensively. And by the time King got to his dissertation at the PhD level, his dissertation was not on Gandhi, it was on Niebuhr. That's who he wrote his dissertation on, Reinhold Niebuhr. The elements of Niebuhr's thinking, he said, this is King talking, helped me to recognize the illusions of a superficial optimism concerning human nature and the dangers of a false idealism. While I still believed in man's potential for good, Niebuhr made me realize his potential for evil. Moreover, Niebuhr helped me to recognize the complexity of man's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. It's working good today. Niebuhr has extraordinary insight. This is still King speaking from his private papers is where I found this. Has extraordinary insight into human nature, especially the behavior of nations and social groups. Groups being the key word. He is keenly aware of the complexity of human motives and of the relation between morality and power. His theology is a persistent reminder. His theology is a persistent reminder of the reality of sin on every level of man's existence. And he caused a minor revolution. Here he is on the Man of the Year, Time magazine. So I teach America in the 60s. I have for a number of years. I do it at James Madison. I did it at Maryland before I left there. And so I deal with the civil rights period extensively for the first 2 weeks of the course. And we talk about what Niebuhr did with this theology of his in terms of the race issue. Basically, he said that when you understand what's happening with the segregation and racial injustice in America, white people will never, ever accept equality of black people, and they will never, ever accept segregation unless they are forced to do it. And King believed that. So he combined the peaceful resistance of Gandhi with the coercive theology of Niebuhr. And so I coined the term, which is very close to what Niebuhr was saying, coercive nonviolence. And if you can't say that on my final exam, you lose 6 points right there. Coercive nonviolence is what Niebuhr brought to King. And what that means is to stand right in the front, in the belly of the beast, and take it. Take a beating, die if you need to. And it's hard, but at the time when television is just coming online in the United States, it worked. But you have to put your own body on the line. That's Gandhi. just read. Didn't need to read it, know it by heart.
Is this Martin Luther King writing this?
Yes, no, this here is from Niebuhr. I just said it a minute ago. I could have read it off the slide, but getting ahead of my skis, I know this stuff by I could probably throw all this stuff away. All this paper up here.
Just read your slides, John. You're all right.
Okay. After Kennedy won the Democratic nomination, King became the target of three conflicting forces. They converged upon him at the time of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, conference, which opened on 14 October. Negotiations between King and Kennedy took place through many phone calls by a staffer, Harris Wofford. That's... So what happened was they were talking about meeting, and so King said that, look, fine, we'll do this, and we'll pick the place. They argued about that, but I'm going to have to at least offer Nixon a chance to do it too. And Wofford was really disappointed. Do you really have to? Do you feel you have to do that? Yes, King said. I don't think Mr. Nixon will accept, but I have to give him a chance. When Wofford relayed King's response to Kennedy afterwards, the senator instantly replied, "To hell with that. I'm taking a much greater risk in the South than Nixon, but King wants to treat us as equals. Tell him it's off." And King's close friends urged him to declare his support for Kennedy, but King made it clear that he would not endorse any candidate publicly. So the scuttling of the meeting with King would meant that he would be in Atlanta after all. As it turned out, Dr. King was destined to attend that particular student sit-in that day. And so this is what happened. He agrees to the sit-in. He was the first to be arrested and the first to speak in the court of Judge James Webb, who set bond at $250 pending trial. And that was his first night he ever spent in jail. King chose jail rather than bail because he wanted to do coercive nonviolence. He would not accept bail. After 5 days, the Georgia charges were dropped, but the arrest was rolled into a previous traffic misdemeanor in DeKalb County. On 4 May 1960, police had stopped him, this is him actually out of his own papers, in DeKalb County, discovered that he had an Alabama driver's license and gave him a ticket. I had gone to court, he said. The lawyer pleaded guilty for me. They fined me $25 and placed me on 6 months probation. I never knew that the lawyer had pleaded guilty. He made me think it was clear all I needed to do was pay. Solicitor Jack Smith demanded a harsh penalty, the prosecutor saying that King had shown no sign of penitence or remorse. After King's chief attorney, Donald Hallowell, presented character witnesses and cogent arguments, Mitchell banged the gavel, revoked King's probation, and ordered him to serve 4 months at hard labor at the State Road Gang, beginning immediately. At 3 a.m., they took me to Reidsville, 220 miles from Atlanta. They chained me down to my legs and tied me to the floor. It was a long ride. That kind of mental anguish is worse than dying. Riding for mile after mile, hungry and thirsty, bound and helpless, waiting and not knowing what you're waiting for, all over a traffic violation. Coretta King was hysterical at the time. She reached Harris Wofford, and she had just received the one phone call. King was allowed on the arrival at the Reidsville State Prison. They'd yanked him out of the jail in the middle of the night without warning, she said. No one had any idea what would happen next. She was pregnant. She feared her husband would be lynched. Stunned, Senator Kennedy now faced the seemingly impossible task of balancing votes between northern white Americans and southern white bigots. The Nixon campaign faced the same vexing problem. How the two candidates decided to handle the crisis crucially impacted one of the closest elections in history. Senator Kennedy called Coretta King and expressed his concern. And by the way, that call was made behind the back of the campaign staff. They were at a hotel, and the staff went somewhere to eat. And Kennedy was alone in the room, and Wofford went in there and caught him alone and told him to call Coretta King. And Kennedy said, okay, I'll do that. He was in his pajamas and made the call. And when the other guys got back, they were angry with Wofford that he'd pulled a fast one on them, waited till he was out of the room. So there's a lot of serendipity just at just about every inflection point in this strange story. Anyway, Robert Kennedy, when he finds out, is really angry about the situation. He called the judge, and King was released the next day. This is Robert Kennedy talking about how much it burned him up the more he thought about what a son of a bitch the judge was. I made it clear to him that I believe the right of all defendants to make bond, that I opposed this and felt that it was disgraceful. That's actually illegal, illegally tampering with the judicial system, but if he didn't do it, King may never have lived. This is, again, out of King's notes here. Senator Kennedy made the call to Coretta because of his humanitarian bent. He had come to know me as a person. In the debates, he had done a good job when he talked about civil rights and what the Negro faces. At the same time, I think he naturally had political considerations in mind. He was running for an office, and he needed to be elected, and I'm sure he felt the need for Negro votes. It indicated the direction that this man would take if he became president. He had been supposedly close to me. Oh, this is, excuse me. He's talking about Nixon here. Nixon didn't do anything about it. It said nothing about it, and it indicated to the King that what would happen if Nixon became president. He'd supposedly been close to me and would call me, frequently seeking my advice, and yet when the moment came, it was like he had never heard of me. This is why I really considered him a moral coward, and I'm convinced that he lost the election because of that.
Talking about Nixon.
Yes, yes, talking about Nixon. So at this point, in no uncertain terms, Bobby directs Wofford and Martin, his associate, to refrain from doing anything else controversial for the rest of the campaign. There would be no literature, no press conferences, no little schemes, nothing at all that made it into the newspapers. The abruptness with which he dismissed them underscored the thin ice upon which their campaign jobs remained. By his own intervention with Judge Mitchell, of course, he had broken his own ban against the campaign involvement in the case. The civil rights staffers in the Kennedy campaign were poised to exploit this change that Bobby had made. It was only a matter of time to take the big leap. The situation was indeed ripe for the final step in this amazing 14-day sequence of events. They would run no newspaper ads or do anything else likely to filter into the white or black press. They formed a dummy committee of preachers who would protect the campaign against what they were planning to do. They would include no statement from Kennedy spokesman and not mention Robert Kennedy's call to the judge. What they did was to put a pamphlet together. It was on blue paper, so they called it the Blue Bomb. And they made about 2 million copies of it, and it distributed it all over the United States to African-American churches. And the preachers would preach in the pulpit that day, and then as they walked out of the churches, they were given the pamphlet all across America. Well, this is Daddy King. He was going to vote against John Kennedy because he was a Catholic, but when He had the courage to wipe the tears from my daughter-in-law's eyes. Then I have the courage to vote for him, Catholic or not. And I've got a whole suitcase full of votes that I'm taking up and putting on the lap of John Kennedy. That's King Sr. That's yeah.
There was a great quote that Kennedy said about King's father. He said, imagine King's father a bigot.
Yeah, well, King's father wasn't a bigot, but he was like Jackie Robinson and the rest.
Because he was a Catholic.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
So I love that quote that Kennedy said, imagine King's
Yeah.
This is King wrote this?
This is his father. This is
His body.
King's father. Yeah. Look, most of the blacks were for the Republican Party. All the entertainers and Jackie Robinson were Nixon, supporting Nixon during the campaign, and that's how it had been for all the way back. Everywhere in the African-American community, the church bells of the Kennedy intervention were ringing. And on Sunday before the election, all across the country, the blue bomb pamphlets were distributed outside of African-American churches after enthusiastic worship services. The result was an unanticipated and stunning upset. Illinois, and this is interesting, right? So we talk about the stealing of the ballot boxes in Ward 1 by the mob. But Illinois was carried by only 9,000 votes. So sure, those few boxes probably would make that difference. But when you look at 250,000 blacks voted for Kennedy, you see the difference. A couple of ballot boxes compared to 250,000 votes isn't even in the same universe. Michigan was carried by 67,000 votes. And another 250,000 blacks voted for Kennedy there. In South Carolina, you see the same thing. 10,000 vote margin, 40,000 black votes. And as you go through Theodore White's book, Making of the President, you'll see that the black vote put about 12 states out of Nixon's column into Kennedy's. It was going to be a landslide for Nixon. You had a question?
What is the content of that blue bomb?
The call to Coretta King. Yeah, the call to Coretta King. They didn't put the Bobby's call to the judge in there.
Without the Kennedy campaign.
No, this was done behind their backs. They had no idea until this popped out the day, on the day there was nothing they could do about it. Yeah.
Did you actually get a copy, get your hands on a blue bomb?
No, but I'd love to. I'd love to have one and get it framed, put it on my wall. Yeah. In the North, Detroit, the black vote ran 8-1 or better. On the south side of Chicago, blacks ran 4-1. In the South, Memphis, Tennessee, Ward 35 was typical. The switch from 36% Democratic in 1956 to 67% in 1960. So even in the South, you see this trend. So in the immediate post-mortem of the 1960 election, the King case leaped to national attention, and the race issue was looked at the time as a big clue. Some reporters did unearth the story about the blue bomb, and others did mention the fact that JFK and even RFK had made phone calls. I believe that that knowledge was basically lost very quickly, gathering dust in the libraries. I've never seen anything about it in most books, even in Theodore White's book. Other than reporting some of the statistics, the sequence of events that I just laid out for you is just, it's lost to history. So I'm left pondering this rather strange dichotomy. We want to think about all the bad things that did not happen that would have taken place if the role of race hadn't existed. War in Vietnam, war in Laos, war in Cuba. And what about the good things that wouldn't have happened had there been no race, the role of the race issue? No new frontier, no Keynesian economics, no increased minimum wage, no depressed areas development, no proposals for Medicaid, Medicare, and increased Social Security benefits, the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, and no wars. So unlike Sam Halpern, who said they were gadflies and didn't care anything for the United States except for their own coat of arms, Halpern forgot about all the things that the Kennedys did do. And not to mention Big Steel and all these other things. You go on, the list is very long. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and you sort of touched on it, but there would have been nuclear war with Nixon.
Can you speak louder, sir, please?
There would have been nuclear war if Nixon had been elected. He would have debated if he was
Yeah, I deal with that issue in I have a whole chapter, chapter 3 or so. Very early on, the Pentagon presented Kennedy with something called the net evaluation, which was that actually the missile gap didn't, well, there was a missile gap, but it wasn't the Soviet Union ahead of us. We were ahead of them, and it was growing fast. And they said that within a year or two, we would have the ability to conduct a counterforce strike against all the Soviet targets, and they were advising the president to do that, to do a first strike against the Soviet Union. Kennedy got so angry in that meeting that he got up and walked out, and then he gave an order that nobody who was there would ever talk about what had been said in that meeting. Jamie Galbraith from right here in Dallas is the one who found that out and first published it in a local newspaper here and then in a journal.
Austin.
Yeah.
He's in Austin.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Close to here. Close to here. A Texan. Anyway, so it's remarkable that all three of these men dared to struggle for racial justice. And at a time when it was very difficult for the Democrats to do this. And Kennedy was reluctant. There are some episodes that I deal with in Volume 3 about this, on the Freedom Rides. But if you are familiar with the American University speech in 1963, he had changed his mind on this and intended to carry forward had he been alive and reelected. And for Bobby Kennedy, he completely was transformed in the years that followed. He became a complete champion for the black cause and civil rights. And all three of them would be dead within 10 years, all three of them. Anyway, it's a sad ending, but an interesting story. Thank you very much.